much. As has been said, my name's Gareth, and it's a real privilege just to be able to be with you guys and to be involved in the events week this week. I want to thank you guys for coming to this particular talk, especially if you're not part of the CU or if you're here just for the first time. It really means a lot to me. I know that you probably won't know me, and I don't know you. So I know that you're not here to listen to me. It's the topic that is of real interest, and I hope that I'll do that the dignity and the credit that it deserves over the next few minutes. I'm going to speak for about 20-25 minutes, and we'll just run through the PowerPoint quite quickly. This is a huge topic, right? And I'm not going to be able to cover everything, but what I hope this will be is just to share a bit of an introduction that'll prime questions for you to be able to ask as we go through. So if questions do emerge over the course of the next 20-25 minutes, then please write them down and stick them in the text, because the Q&A part is the most fun. So we'll get into that shortly. I just want to, before I start, just also make you aware that there may be some things in the content of what I say that might be triggering in some ways. So not very much, I would expect, but I am going to just mention examples of abuse and trauma, just to be careful of that. I'm not coming at this from an abstract point of view. I have experienced forms of sexual abuse myself as a child, not at the result of the church or anything like that, but I have actually experienced trauma as well in Christian context. So this is important for me as for anybody else. I'm sure you guys have seen this Imagine video that was curated by 25 sort of A-list celebrities. It became famous for all the wrong reasons, because it was kind of cringeworthy. A bunch of privileged celebrities thinking that they would speak to a world in the midst of a pandemic by basically butchering one of the most famous songs of the 20th century. But John Lennon's Imagine is one of the most famous songs, but it's also a song that diagnoses the problems with the world as a religious problem. And that kind of was captured by Richard Dawkins in one of the most influential books on atheism of the last 15 years. He starts the entire book by saying this: his case against God begins this way. Imagine, with John Lennon, a world with no religion. Imagine no suicide bombers, no 9/11, no crusades, witch hunts. He goes down and says no Northern Ireland troubles, no honour killings. He basically lists this catalogue of vice and trauma and the dark parts of our history, and basically says, if we could just get rid of God, then the world would be a better place. And so I find that interesting, because I think a guy like Richard Dawkins would say himself that one of the things that radicalized his atheism wasn't this idea that Christianity was just a myth, an innocent myth like the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus, but it was actually a myth that impacted people for bad and actually caused real harm and damage. So is religion actually the problem with the world? I mean, that vision that John Lennon talks about, you don't need to think that God is a delusion in order to find that attractive. But is the diagnosis for what's wrong with society actually religion, and in our case, Christianity? Here's what one famous professor of physics and Nobel Prize winner, Steven Weinberg, says. He said, look, religion is an insult to human dignity. With or without it, you'd simply have good people doing good things and evil people doing evil things. But for good people to become evil and do evil things, that takes religion. In other words, either some people are good or other people are bad. But the problem with religion is that it influences people. It makes them believe in absolutes and become dogmatic, and radicalizes them to the point where they then demonize anybody who doesn't agree with them, even to the point of violence. And I think we need to be really honest about the fact that Even in our just general knowledge, we're aware that there are some skeletons in the church's closet. The history of the Christian church is not always a pleasant one, whether that's things like crusades, where the idea of the kingdom of God became something that was about earthly territory, that was headquartered in Jerusalem, or where soldiers and priests draped in Christian crosses and in the name of Christianity and with the promise of eternal life went to the Middle East and slaughtered in the name of holy war thousands upon thousands of Muslims and Jews, or the Salem witch trials that we're probably quite aware of, or the famous greasy televangelists who dupe gullible people into a gospel of health and wealth and perform phony miracles and take money from vulnerable and often poor people in order to line their own lavish lifestyles, or extreme forms of bigotry like we've seen on Louis Theroux documentaries with the Westboro Baptist Church, where they picket outside funerals or outside abortion clinics and basically condemn people and heap all kinds of different abuse on people, all in the name of God. And this isn't actually an abstract issue for us on this island. We have seen violence and sectarianism condoned and encouraged, even in the name of Christianity. We've been horrified to discover both the scale and the depth of depravity, the depravity of physical and sexual abuse perpetrated often towards children, and the appalling shame of institutional cover-up, where priests and bishops and the church itself has wielded incredible power in communities so that people either never speak up or so that these issues are never addressed, even if leaders know about them, because people want to protect the reputation of the institution. And even most recently, just the scandals in our country of the mother and baby homes, where those who are often most vulnerable, often the victims themselves of predatory abuse by men, were then labeled often by institutions and communities run by the church, labeled as sinners and shameful, and without their consent had their babies taken away from them and were subject to all kinds of horrendous institutional abuse, all under the authority of a church that was drunk with power. Now, none of this, is fair to say, is unique to Christianity, whether it's in sport, whether it's in the media, whether it's in politics. We're all aware of the potential for human beings to commit horrendous crimes, often powerful people, and to subject victims to decades of trauma and silence, all because basically they're just not strong enough and don't have a voice in order to speak up. But I guess what's so tragic and despicable about this being involved in Christianity is that sense of hypocrisy, that those who claim to represent a God of love, a God who's for women and children and victims and the vulnerable, would themselves, even though they wear garments of holiness and clerical honor, would themselves in quietness and in locked doors commit all kinds of completely indefensible abuse. And it is indefensible. I am not in this talk in any way going to try and defend the indefensible. We need to call this stuff what it is, and that is utterly evil, and perpetrators should face the full weight of justice. And the reason why I say that is not in spite of being a Christian, but precisely because I am a Christian. Jesus never excused ideas or behavior perpetrated by those who associated with him that were morally heinous or evil, no matter who those individuals were. And that is because Christianity is ultimately about justice, and it's ultimately about the truth. It is not about protecting the reputations of individuals or institutions. In fact, the other reason why I think this is really important and Jesus never excused it is because when forms and human dynamics of power are wielded in order to protect or advance the Christian message, you often cut people's ears off. There's a really interesting story about the Apostle Peter when Jesus was about to be arrested by the religious rulers. Peter wielded a sword in order to defend Jesus and tried to cut off the head of the high priest's servants, and wasn't a great shot, so he ended up cutting off his ear. But I think the Bible is telling us a very important message, because Jesus rebuked Peter in the strongest terms and told him to put his sword away. That's not what this is about. And then Jesus healed the ear of the servant. And I think what the Bible is subtly, but very importantly, telling us in a story like that is that when you wield the instruments of human power in order to advance or defend Christianity, you cut people's ears off to a fair and open hearing of what Christianity actually is. And there are thousands, if not millions, of people in Ireland who, in a sense, have closed their ears to Christianity because of how rightfully they've been disgusted by abuse done in its name. I think this brings us to really two major questions, though, as we address this topic. The first is to ask the question, to what extent has Christianity actually been the cause of harm and hypocrisy? And the second question is, okay, where we have seen that evil has clearly been perpetrated in association with Christianity, is that evil the direct result of Christian teaching, or is it a gross perversion of its teaching? So if we just take the first question about the extent of harm or good, because that's really what's on the line here. You read a statement like I read from the God Delusion at the beginning, you think, well, of course, Christianity it causes these heinous problems. There's nothing good about it. Let's get rid of it. But how true is that? If we just take the example of religious wars, often people associate violence and wars to be the result of religious ideas. But when that's been investigated, there's a couple of guys called Charles Phillips and Alan Axelrod, who are two historians of war, who've put together this massive volume called the Encyclopedia of Wars that you can buy on Amazon for about €300 if you need. If you have trouble sleeping at night, I thoroughly recommend it. But basically, they've documented wars from the 2nd or 3rd century BC right through to present day, in order to ask, one of the questions that they ask at least is, how much have these been influenced by religion? And they discover that only less than probably 7% of all wars was religiously inspired, and less than 4% when you don't can factor in internal Islamic wars. Religious wars account for less than 2% of all casualties of war, and hundreds of millions more have actually been killed by irreligious ideologies than by religious violence. Now, that doesn't excuse any violence caused in the name of religion, but it does help us get an idea of perspective, because the other thing we need to consider in all this that's often missing in a book like The God Delusion is the tremendous influence for good that Christianity has had. There's a couple of books here written by social historians, not Christians, but what they've basically said is that in the ancient world, ideas of dignity and intrinsic human worth and value and rights and justice, they didn't exist, or they only existed for an elite few. This idea that everyone deserves justice, that every human being has value, all the kind of humanistic ideas and values that we enjoy in the 21st century. These guys say that they are actually the result of Christianity, that it's Christianity and Christian ideas that brought them about. And although they're just such normal ideas that kind of exist in the air that we breathe, we often don't know where they come from. But they said without Christianity, it's very unlikely that these ideas would have taken hold. Or take the example of an atheist writer for the Times, Matthew Paris, really influential journalist. He tells a story as an atheist about his own experience of the influence of Christianity in Africa, when he says, traveling to Malawi refreshed another belief too, one that I've been trying to banish my whole life. But an observation I've been unable to avoid since my African childhood. It confounds my ideological beliefs, it stubbornly refuses to fit my worldview, and it's embarrassed my growing belief that there is no God. Now a confirmed atheist, I've become convinced of the enormous contribution that Christian evangelism actually makes to Africa. sharply distinct from the work of secular NGOs, government projects, and international aid efforts. These alone will not do. In Africa, Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings spiritual transformation, and the rebirth is real and the change is good. I used to avoid this truth, he says, by applauding, as you can, the practical work of mission churches in Africa. It's a pity, I would say, that salvation was part of the package. But Christians, black and white, working in Africa, do heal the sick. They do teach people to read and write. And only the severest kind of secularist could see a mission hospital or a school and say that the world would be better without it. We need to get a sense of proportion. As heinous and disgusting as some of the things that we've already looked at are, the influence of Christianity in the world is a far bigger and more complex picture. But secondly, the second question that I want us to think about for the next few minutes is, okay, where evil has been perpetrated, as we've seen in association with Christianity, is it actually faithful and a direct result of Christian teaching, or is it actually a perversion of Christian teaching? What I mean is this. This is the Samsung Galaxy Note 7, which I think back in 2016 was marketed to lead the way in smartphone technology. The problem was after about a month or 6 weeks or so, the entire product was recalled. The reason why? It caused harm. It was dangerous because it had an unstable battery. It was dangerous by design. And yet, if I was to take a different phone, say an iPhone or something, and go into the Genius bar and say to the guys, look, this phone is dangerous, it's unstable, I think there's something wrong with the battery, you need to recall this entire model. They probably, before doing that, would ask me, okay, well, have you, it's clearly dangerous, have you done anything with it? Have you tampered with it? And if I was to say to them, oh yeah, I'm into electronics, I like to take things apart and mess things around and move wires around and see how things work, chances are that they wouldn't then recall the entire model of that iPhone. Why? Because it's not actually dangerous by design. It's dangerous by how I have abused and perverted how it was designed. And I think we need to be open to the same possibility when it comes to any worldview, but especially Christianity. One of the reasons why I take the Bible seriously is because it doesn't whitewash over the flaws of those who associate with Jesus. It's really honest and open and embarrassing about some of the ideas and some of the things that they propagate. So, for example, there's one occasion where Jesus going through a village of Samaria, and the Samaritans and the Jews had massive cultural tensions and animosity towards one another, and because of that the Samaritans refused to offer Jesus, who's a Jew, a place to stay. And Jesus's disciples, two of the apostles, James and John, get really self-righteous about this and think that Jesus is going to pat them on the back when saying, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and destroy them? And Jesus turns to them, the New Testament says, and rebukes them publicly. Again, on another occasion, it said that Peter was the first pope. He had certain ideas that were completely contrary to what Christianity was really all about and how Jesus was going to bring about the kingdom that he talked about inviting people into. And rather than just sort of excuse it in order to save face, rather than not let that be included in the Gospels and in the record of the eyewitnesses, it's up front and center. The Bible talks about this stuff, but it also shows us how Jesus responds to it. He doesn't try to cover it up. He doesn't give them a Bible. He doesn't try to mitigate it because, these are his disciples. These are the guys who are going to bring the gospel to the world. So let's not tell anyone that this ever happened and it'll just be our little secret. No, he confronts it in the strongest possible terms, no matter who says it. There's no nepotism. There's no favoritism. He calls this stuff what it is: evil, satanic, stupid, full of misunderstanding. So if you want to know what Jesus thinks about the kind of evils that have been perpetrated by people who associate with him, I think we have good basis for saying that Jesus doesn't excuse it. He takes it seriously. He calls it what it is, and he will hold those people to account. We should be very careful about judging any worldview by its abuse. So as we move towards a finish, let's think about this question then. Okay, so if that's what we see, is Christianity actually about removing people's freedom and dignity and trying to control them? In other words, on what basis does God expect people to be Christian? Is it just through cultural influence? So because we grew up in a Christian environment, we're Christian and not Muslim? Is it simply through political influence? Is it through military influence in the same way that other kingdoms came about by the strong just overthrowing the weak? And so on one hand, maybe you started off as a Jew, but then the Romans came in and they start propagating all of their particular pagan religion, and you just had no choice about the matter. Is that the way Jesus said Christianity would come about? Well, it's a question that the Bible takes really seriously, and Jesus actually has a conversation about the dynamics, the power dynamics in how Christianity is to come about, how it's to be advanced and defended, with a figure known as Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate knew, as a military man himself, that kingdoms come about through force and authority and taking away people's freedom to just live under who is top dog at the time. And he had heard then that Jesus had been brought before him on charges that he was a king and he claimed to have a kingdom. And so he's asking this question: is who Jesus is and what his kingdom is a threat to me and to my kingdom? Is this kingdom that Jesus talks about going to do the same thing and use the same kind of human dynamics of power? And he interrogates Jesus on this basis. But what Jesus tells him is this: that his kingdom is not of this world. In other words, it doesn't come about by those kinds of mechanisms. Because if it were, then his servants would fight to prevent his arrest. But Jesus stopped them from fighting. He says, my kingdom is from another place. And then Pilate said to him, so you are a king then? And Jesus said, you say that I am a king. But in fact, the reason I was born and came into the world, this is what Christianity is all about. This is what my kingdom's all about, Jesus says, is to testify to the truth. And everyone who's on the side of truth listens and follows me. And immediately Pilate goes out and tells the crowd, I find no basis for a charge against him. Jesus is not a threat to people's dignity and freedom. Why? Why did Pilate know that based on what Jesus said? Because if Christianity is truly what Jesus claimed it was, not about forcing people to believe stuff, not about persecuting people who don't believe what they're meant to believe, but simply about exposing people to the truth. What Pilate knew is that if it's about truth rather than power, you cannot force people to believe sincerely for themselves that something is true by power. You can, by power, force people to live under your version of what is true. Many despots do, even religious despots. But Jesus says that's not what Christianity is about. It's not propagated, it's not defended by power, but by exposing people to truth and allowing them the freedom to make up their minds for themselves and respond to it. Martin Luther King, famous figure, at the occasion of winning the Nobel Peace Prize, gave a speech in which he said, the only way in which the world can experience true and lasting peace was when we discover unarmed truth and unconditional love. When truth comes without force and unarmed, and when people are loved not on the basis of what they believe or how they act, but unconditionally. And for Dr. King, the central figure who propagated that kind of message was Jesus Christ. I want to finish by continuing, though, just to go back to where we started. Because if this is true Christianity, it really raises the question, okay, well then why do we do these things? Why do these evils happen? Where is then the true source of harm and hypocrisy if it's not religion? And I'd like us just very humbly to be open to the fact that actually the problem might be with us. The common denominator in how people can use religion for good and for bad, or how people can use science or politics or the internet, both for real good, but also for extreme evil. The common denominator in all that story is human beings. That the problem with harm and hypocrisy might not necessarily be the systems or a lack of education, but the heart of the problem is the problem of the human heart. G.K. Chesterton, the famous author, once wrote to the Times newspaper in response to their question, what is wrong with the world? And he said, "Dear sir, in response to your question, what is wrong with the world? I am, yours faithfully, G.K. Chesterton." And I think if we're honest and we look at ourselves, we all have the potential through different ways to be harmful and hypocritical when it comes towards other people, to say things online, to say things behind people's backs, to treat people purely by the sum of their Instagram photos, relate to them purely on the basis of their physical appearance or their sporting or their intellectual ability, and then reject them on the same basis. We all have that potential for great harm and for great good. And so it's simply not as simplistic as Steven Weinberg says, even though he's a brilliant physicist. It's not simply that there's goodies and baddies, but it's actually that we are good and baddies. This is what Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian novelist, said about it. He says, if only it were this simple, if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to destroy them, to separate them from the rest of us, and destroy them. But, he says, the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his heart? Yes, there are scales of good and evil potential in our home hearts. And maybe circumstances and education does have an influence of that. But I think that's one of the reasons why I find the Bible so compelling, because it agrees with Solzhenitsyn. The very beginning of the gospel is a story, or the Bible is a story of how God intended the world to be, and then how that whole thing fractured, where people turned away from God and towards themselves. And the product of that was that not only did they turn away from the relationship they were intended to have with God, but they turned away from each other and began to relate to each other on the basis of survival of the fittest, where brother turns against brother and sister against sister. And I guess if that really is where the heart of the problem lies, the real question is, can anything change the potential for harm and hypocrisy that exists in every human heart? Let's go back to our friend Matthew Paris, the atheist writer in the Times, and what he says. He says, in Africa, Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings spiritual transformation. The rebirth is real. The change is good. That is the promise of what Christianity does, that people who trust in God and commit their lives to Him are changed at the deepest level of their human hearts and are given a new kind of power in order to overcome the evil and the vice that lurks even in potential form in all of us. I want to finish with this story because of my time is up, but maybe you'll just indulge the story. This guy is called Tom Tarrance. He's one of my mentors. He's based in America. He's one of the kindest, most gentle, most inclusive, most godly men that I've ever met. And what most people don't know is that Tom Tarrance was also this guy. He was, in the 1960s, one of the most wanted men in America. He was a member of the Ku Klux Klan and was riddled with prejudice and hatred towards communists and Jews and members of the African American community. So much so that he eventually went to plant a bomb at the home of a local Jewish council member and was caught by the police in a massive shootout. His accomplice was killed on the spot. He managed to get away, but was eventually caught by the police, was riddled with bullets, managed to survive, was put in a maximum security prison, still absolutely saturated with hatred and evil and animosity. Decided that he didn't like the maximum security prison, so he decided that he was going to escape. He did escape. The authorities, the CIA, the FBI managed to track him down. There was another gunfight. Some of his accomplices were killed as well. He managed to survive. He was sentenced. He nearly got the death sentence. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. And while he was there, he began to read certain books. The first book he read was Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler. But the second book that he began to read was the Gospels. And even though for so much of his life, Tom Torrance assumed that his prejudice and his views and his hatred towards other people was backed up by Christianity, he discovered actually that Christianity stood against it. He said, not knowing the Bible very well, I overlaid the little religious understanding I did have with this dangerous religious ideology, not realizing the errors I was embracing. Certain false Christian ideas appealed to me because they reinforced my prejudices and gave them a religious justification. My stereotyping and demonizing of communists, Jews, and blacks made it possible to indiscriminately hate the enemy. And the combination of extreme political beliefs undergirded by religious justification created a sense of holy cause. God was on our side, and therefore he could not be on the other side. When he took a firm look at the Gospels for himself and actually engaged with what the Bible actually said rather than just assume that it backed him up, he realized he was unfounded. He realized that this evil was deep in his own heart. And not just was he at enmity with other people, but he was at enmity with God himself. He said, for the first time, I realized on a deeply personal level that I had sinned against God and needed his forgiveness. And he found it. And his life totally changed. People didn't believe it for a long time. They thought he's just got religion. He's just trying to get out of prison. But eventually, some of the people that he tried to kill, some of the officers, an officer who he shot in the heart but managed to survive, came to him and embraced him and reconciled with him after years because they knew, like Matthew Parris said, the gospel was able to get to this kind of level. The transformation was at the heart and the change was good. It made a difference. And I don't know about you, but I'm just wondering if we might need more of that, because if that's what Christianity does, despite the skeletons in the closet, maybe we need to take a fresh look at it. And I invite you to do that as we ask some questions about it.